Okay, I think everyone's fairly comfortably settled. I'm Aparna. I coordinate the Science and Society program here at NCBS, and thank you all for being here. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Anil Ananthswamy. He's a consultant and former deputy news editor and staff writer for the London-based New Scientist magazine. After a decade spent as a software engineer, he trained to be a science journalist at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His work focuses on physics, neuroscience, and climate change. In 2013, he won the UK Institute of Physics inaugural Physics Journalism Award and the British Association of Science Writers Award for Best Investigative Journalism. Close to home, all of us know Anil for the annual science journalism course that he began in 2011. The first edition was mainly for NCBS and ISE students, and since we've had students from across the country, he finished the 5th edition very successfully, and over 50 students have attended this workshop. Some of them have begun to write about science for a living, so I think probably really inspired by his work. In 2010, he published his first book, The Edge of Physics, and this book was voted Book of the Year in UK by the Physics World. And most recently, Anil published his second book, The Man Who Wasn't There, Investigations into the Strange New Science of Self. His talk today, Perceptions of Self, is based on this book. I'd like you all to welcome Anil, and thank you so much for being here, sharing with us.
Thank you, Aparna, for the introduction. And can you hear me? Yeah. 5 years ago, I gave a talk here on my physics book, and at the time, NCBS was new to me, and the only person I knew at the time was Sanjay, a friend that goes back to our Berkeley days. And it is a real pleasure for me to come back here to give this talk. Over the last 5 years, I've been associated, as Aparna said, with NCBS doing the science journalism workshop. And so I can very gladly say that today I'm speaking in the presence of many colleagues and friends. So it is a real joy to be sharing this with you. What I'm going to talk about today is basically about what neuroscience and specifically neuropsychology is telling us about the human sense of self. Now, when we talk about the sense of self, most of us, well, all of us, have an intuitive sense of what that is. It's there when we wake up. It kind of disappears when we go to sleep, seemingly disappears when we go to sleep. It seems to reappear in our dreams. And also, there is a sense we have of being a body here and now. For instance, all of us probably feel, and I hope we feel, that we are embedded, embodied, and we occupy a volume of space that is defined by the body, and we have a sense of identification with the body, and we also have a perspective with which we view the world. We seem to view the world from behind our eyes, from within our heads, and we have a perspective which seems like everything we observe, everything we experience has a mindness to it. It seems to be happening to me, not to somebody else. And that, while it seems kind of trivial to say, is at the heart of what the self is about. There's also this sense of personal identity that spans time. If you were to think about your earliest memories or imagine yourself in the future, again, there is a sense of continuity. There seems to be something that persists across time. So all of these things, intuitively, for us, you know, when somebody were to say, what is your sense of self? Some aspect of all of these things is what we will talk about, right? So you might say, then what is the big mystery? Why are we even concerned about? Yeah, it's obvious that's what the sense of self is. What's the mystery? I just want to read out a quote from Thomas Nagel. He's a philosopher. And I think he says it really beautifully as to what the mystery is. It seems outlandish that the centerless universe, in all its spatio-temporal immensity, should have produced me of all people. There was no such thing as me for ages, but with the formation of a particular physical organism at a particular place and time, suddenly there is me for as long as the organism survives. How can the existence of one member of one species have this remarkable consequence? So in some sense, that is the mystery that you're trying to address when you start examining the nature of the self. And when philosophers, theologians, neuroscientists start talking about the self with any kind of depth, then you end up with a whole bunch of debates. And these are the broad kind of brushstrokes of those debates. One of the things people start arguing about is there a self or not? Can the self exist independent of all else? Which means, basically, does the self have a reality that is something like the reality of the fundamental particles that make up the material world? So can the self exist independent of the electrons and quarks and gluons and etc. that make up the material world? And you would have heard over and over again, probably in popular culture, that the self is an illusion. Well, if the self is an illusion, then whose illusion is it, right? So these kinds of questions keep coming up when we start talking about the self. And one of the things I wanted to do in my book is try to actually get to the heart of what philosophers, neuroscientists, theologians are arguing about when they ask such questions. And it's not quite clear exactly what they're going on about until you start digging into the target of their inquiry. Like, what is it exactly that they're trying to answer or ask questions about when they talk about the self? So the first thing that they're really worried about is something called synchronic unity. Now, what that means is, if you just think about yourself right now, like we just mentioned, we are embodied. We occupy a volume of space that is defined by this body, and you're experiencing a whole range of sensations. You're looking at the stage, you're getting visual input, you're getting auditory input, you're feeling the sensation of sitting on a chair, you're probably feeling the temperature of the air on your skin. So a whole bunch of sensations that you're experiencing. What's interesting about that is all of those experiences are being had by the same entity, right? It's not as if what is being seen by someone, what is being heard by someone else, and what is being felt on the skin, the sense of touch, is being experienced by some other entity. No, all of those things are being experienced by the same entity. Now, this might seem trivial, and it feels trivial because that's how we experience our existence. But actually, from a philosophical point of view, and also from a neuroscientific point of view, trying to explain how this unity comes about. Why is there this perception we have of having one entity that is experiencing everything at the same time? And that's quite a puzzle. The other thing is something called diachronic unity, which is, we just talked about, the sense of self includes this idea that if you think back to your earliest memories, think back to your childhood, or if you think to some imagined future self, and whether those rememberings or imaginings, when they bring up perceptions in your mind, if they bring up emotions or thoughts, whatever comes up in your mind because of those imaginings and remembrances, again, there is this feeling that all of those perceptions are being had by the same entity, right? It's not as if something that imagined your childhood is a different entity and something that imagines the future self is someone else compared to what is here and now. So there is a unity to all your perceptions, whether it is temporal or whether it is the perception of bodily sensations here and now. And trying to explain where this unity comes from is at the heart of what sort of philosophers and neuroscientists are trying to address. Yeah? And it's because of this perceived unity. I say perceived unity because there is disagreement over whether this unity is because of anything underlying or is it actually just a perception itself. So trying to explain where this unity comes from is why sometimes some philosophers will say there must be a self, there must be something that remains beneath all these perceptions and experiences that is the recipient or the subject of everything, right? So these are the kind of questions that are being addressed by people who are interested in understanding the nature of the self. Now, one way to look at something that has such a unity is by looking at situations and neuropsychological conditions where this unity breaks down. So I have here a list of 8 different neuropsychological conditions, each of which disturbs the self in a slightly different way. So partly why understanding the human self is such a big problem is because if you were to just ask anyone whose self is, healthy and sort of undisturbed in any profound way, then it's very hard to make sense of it in terms of the self being a bunch of different processes. But if you look at any of these conditions, it turns out that some little part of the self goes wrong, and you have an experience of being someone that is slightly different than if that part had not gone wrong or had not changed. So, for instance, I'll just quickly run through it, and we'll come back to some of these in a little bit of greater detail. Cotard syndrome, for instance, this is a syndrome that is very rare. There are only about a few hundred cases recorded in medical literature, and it's a condition in which people will say that they don't exist, right? They are convinced that they are dead. Now, immediately the question arises, who or what is saying I don't exist? What is that I that is saying I don't exist? So just like all of us, hopefully, are convinced that we exist, someone with Cotard syndrome is going to say, I don't exist. So instantly, by looking at the neuropsychology of Cotard syndrome, you can start asking some basic questions about what it means to even say I exist. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder where it begins with short-term memory loss and eventually destroys cognitive abilities to the point that the person doesn't remember, the people don't remember who they are, and it destroys a certain aspect of oneself. And by looking at that, you can get a sense of some other, other things that are happening in the human brain that create our larger sense of self. Body integrity identity disorder is a condition where people will feel disruptions of their bodily self. They feel like some part of their body doesn't belong to them, and that sheds light on how the brain might construct the bodily self, the feeling of being in a body and the feeling that all my body parts are mine. Now that's, again, something that sounds silly and trivial, but there are situations where that can get disrupted. Schizophrenia is a condition in which people have psychosis, where their sense of reality is altered, sometimes dramatically so. They hear voices, they have thoughts in their head that don't feel like their own. So again, schizophrenia sheds light on some other aspects of the self. These are all, all of these conditions can be thought of as conditions without thinking about the self, but they're all also conditions that disturb the self. Depersonalization disorder is one in which people feel estranged from their emotions and their bodily self. Autism has disturbances of the social self. Autoscopic phenomena, these are out-of-body experiences where, if you've talked to anyone who has experienced it, they will tell you that they feel like they have left their own body. So the question is immediately, what has left the body? And, and by understanding what has left or what has not left the body, you can start basically understanding why we even have the experience of being in a body, which is our basic, existential experience. There's ecstatic epilepsy, which is a form of epilepsy where people have near mystical experiences. Well, the experience is not mystical, but when they talk about how they feel during ecstatic epilepsy, the phenomenology of that condition mirrors something that mystics would say is happening to them. Now, the way in which you can look at all these neuropsychological conditions is that some part of the self has changed, has been altered in some very profound way, has gone away. And by looking at these, we can start getting an idea of what the very basis of the self might be. So when we say something like, I don't exist, you can start asking that question, who or what is that I? And there is this kind of approach, this is not something that I've come up with. This is an approach within neuropsychology. And if you think about how much we've learned about the brain over the last few decades, a lot of it has come from this kind of approach where you have someone who's had a tumor, a lesion, some stroke, something has happened where you've lost some part of the brain, and there has been some behavioral consequence to that. And by correlating the loss of brain tissue with the changes in behavior, you can start understanding what might be happening to certain, in terms of brain functionality. And this is something similar when it comes to the self, where you're taking the self as a whole and saying, what happens if some aspects of the self get changed? Can we understand how the brain and body together might be putting together the self in the first place. If this is reminiscent of a philosophical approach that comes from certain traditions within India, that is not surprising because it is. And I'd like to play you a snippet of a song sung by Pandit Jasraj. This is a poem written by Adi Shankara in the 8th century about the Advaitin tradition in which they're asking the question, who am I, and trying to answer that question. So let me just play you that. It's a minute long. So I cut that song off abruptly at that point for a reason, because the next line is the answer to the question, who am I, but from a very particular philosophical tradition. It's not an answer that everyone will agree with, and in some sense, the point of this whole exercise is not to say what the answer is from one particular tradition, but to actually understand how they even address the question. So what this particular approach is doing is trying to say, in trying to answer the question, who am I, it's trying to say that let me start by saying what I'm not. So I'm not the mind, I'm not the intellect, I'm not my senses, and so on and so on. And the poem goes on for six stanzas, and the last line of each stanza is a refrain that answers the question, but from a particular theological tradition. So, and there are other traditions within India that will disagree. There are Western philosophers who will disagree with this particular answer, and that's not really the point. I think the point is really that there are ways in which people have approached this problem, and by understanding how they've looked at the problem, we can get a sense for what neuroscience and neuropsychology might be telling us today. So just to give you another idea of how people are looking at the self, this is Scottish philosopher David Hume. This is a very often quoted line by him about what the self might be. And he says, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. So what he's saying is that all we are is a bundle of perception, and if that bundle were to fall apart, there is no I at the center. So these are called bundle theories. A lot of Buddhist traditions will fall into this kind of notion of what the self is, that if you were to unravel all your perceptions, you will find that there is nothing substantial at the center of it. So that's one answer. The Advaitin tradition was another answer. Again, just to give you an example of how people have approached this, probably since the time we became self-aware, that these questions must have been coming at us. So now coming back to the neuropsychological disorders, so we go back to Cotard syndrome. Who or what is saying I don't exist? I'd like to tell you a little story about this man, Graham. He is a British man in his 40s, and he was going through a particularly difficult time in his life and was very depressed, and tried to commit suicide by getting into a bath full of water and pulling an electrical appliance into the water with him, wanting to electrocute himself. And the fuse blew, so fortunately nothing happened to him. 3 weeks later, he developed a delusion of being brain dead. Very, very specific delusion where he said, my brain is dead, right? So he goes to the neurologist, And so I talked extensively with the neurologist who treated him. I didn't get to talk to Graham because by the time I was beginning to write his story, the British press had hounded him, I think, so much that he stopped talking to the press. And you can imagine why. The condition lends itself to sensationalism, whereas it's actually a very, very serious condition. It's people who are suffering from cotards are they're depressed so much that on the scale that we are familiar with, none of the things that we are familiar with even approaches how depressed they can be. And the condition itself was identified by a French psychiatrist in the late 19th century. His name was Jules Cotard, and hence the name. So Graham, when he was talking to his neurologist, the neurologist would ask him, Graham, you can see me, you can hear me, and Graham would say yes. And you can understand what I'm saying, and again the answer would be yes. And then the neurologist would say, but if you can understand me, then your mind is fine. And he would say, yes, my mind is fine. Then the neurologist would then continue to try and argue, saying that if your mind is fine, the brain has something to do with the mind, obviously, so your brain must be fine too. And he would say, no, my brain is dead, my mind might be fine, but my brain is dead. And you could not shake him off this delusion. He even identified with the dead to the extent that he would spend a lot of time in graveyards, just being in the graveyards because he felt more kinship with the dead. And he's not isolated. All cases of Cotard syndrome, there's some aspect of this feeling of being already dead or not existing. People will try to plan their own funerals. People will ask to be buried in a coffin. Whatever their cultural context might be of how they are treated when they're dead, that will play out. So what's happening here? Why is this such a strong delusion? So as it happens, there are not too many studies of people suffering from Cotards, mainly because it's very rare, and also because the condition is so severe that the last thing anyone wants to do is put the people suffering into scanners and try to identify what's happening, right? So in this particular case, Graham actually agreed to be scanned, and it turned out that there were two things that were happening on a very broad scale. In our brain, broadly speaking, when we're talking of conscious awareness, there are two different networks that are operating. One is a network that is responsible for awareness of things external to us. So awareness of sensations, external sensations. And there is an internal awareness network that is responsible for awareness of our own body states, our internal body states, our thoughts, all self-referential thoughts. And when our mind is wandering with self-referential thoughts, that is the second network that is very active. And these two networks are anti-correlated, which means that if you're paying a whole lot of attention to the outside, the activity in the internal awareness network goes down, and vice versa. So if you actually pay intense attention to your own body, through whatever means, then your external awareness network activity goes down. Now, what they found in Graham was that the metabolic activity in the network that's responsible for internal awareness was damped down dramatically to the point that it was resembling the activity seen in patients who are in a vegetative state. So you're really talking of someone whose conscious awareness is very, very low. So, and the hypothesis here is that this was leading Graham to have a perception of his own body and own emotional state that was so unlike what it would be normally. It was so lacking in vividness and vitality that somehow that entered his conscious awareness as non-existence. Now, if that entered your conscious awareness as non-existence, then your rational mind can hopefully, shoot down that perception because you can argue yourself out of it. But in Graham's case, he had another problem, which was there was a very low metabolic activity in his lateral frontal lobes, parts of the brain that are responsible for rational thought. And the hypothesis here is that there was a complete sort of diminishing lack of vivid perception of one's own body and emotional state, and that somehow enters Graham's awareness as not existing, and then he doesn't have the resources in terms of rationality to somehow knock down that perception, and is completely convinced for the duration of the disorder that he is dead, or in this case, he is brain dead, which is a very specific kind of delusion. So, but what's interesting from the perspective of the self here is that there is still an I that is experiencing non-existence, right? It's not that the I has gone away. Just like someone might say I exist, here's Graham saying I don't exist. So there is a subjectivity. Even the non-existence is being experienced. And the question is, what or who, I think the better term here is, what is that subjectivity? What is that I that is experiencing non-existence? And at this point, Cotards doesn't really tell us much more than this, but it at least raises the question that we can start asking, that there is, no matter what you're experiencing, there is always something that is the subject of that experience. And it becomes very clear in Cotards that even when you're saying you're dead, there is someone experiencing being dead. What does that mean, right? Alzheimer's disease allows you to examine the self in a slightly different way. Now, most of you, if we're asked, who are you, we are most likely to give a narrative answer. So, for instance, imagine you're a student who comes to NCBS for an interview for a PhD program, and the professor asks you, who are you? You're not going to say, oh, I'm a body, I'm occupying this volume of space, I'm looking through my head. You're not going to say any of those things. You're going to say, I am so-and-so, I come from this part of the country, I've done this, I've had this education, I plan to do this. So in some sense, you're going to give a narrative answer to who you are. And we all have that narrative in our heads, right? It's a narrative that we use to talk about ourselves to others, but it's also a narrative that's going on internally within ourselves. So it is a very strong aspect of our sense of self. And the reason Alzheimer's is important in trying to shed light on what this means in terms of the self is some philosophers have long argued that the self, the I, is only the narrative. That if you take away the narrative, there is nothing else, nothing left. In some sense, philosophers like Daniel Dennett, and there are many philosophers that have argued that it's because the brain is constructing these narratives, it's the spinning of these narratives that gives us the illusion of an I that is the author of these narratives, right? Now, Alzheimer's actually challenges that notion in multiple ways. One is that one of the things the philosophers have argued is that the narrative is primarily a cognitive construct. That it's something you consciously recall and talk about when you're talking about yourself. When you're trying to answer the question, who are you? You are using your cognitive ability to come up with the answer. And Alzheimer's basically challenges the idea that the narrative is just cognitive. So some of you may know people who are suffering from Alzheimer's. It is a really debilitating disorder, neurodegenerative disorder that starts with short-term memory loss and then eventually just wipes out cognitive abilities to the point that people can't take care of themselves, even basic bodily functions. So, but in the beginning, what's happening is because there's a loss of short-term memory formation, what Alzheimer's does, it actually puts a stop to your narrative self. If you think of what your narrative self is, it's basically a sequence of memories that have to keep forming, right? I mean, every experience that you have, especially if it is something significant emotionally, it will get added to your narrative so that you can recall it the next time and talk about it. Now, if short-term memory formation is being impaired and that memory of something that happened just now does not get added to your long-term memory banks, then somehow it's not part of your narrative anymore. So, for instance, if some of us here today had a short-term memory lapse about this event, which I hope not, but maybe if it happened, then this will not become part of one's narrative, right? And so in some sense, you need the incorporation of significant memories into your long-term memory, and somehow it has to get semanticized, it has to get some meaning for it to become part of your narrative self. And Alzheimer's actually stops the formation of the narrative self. So at the point of disease onset, your narrative self petrifies. And then as the disease progresses, not only does the narrative stop forming, it starts getting scrambled. So if you talk to someone who is in middle stage Alzheimer's, for instance, they will still be able to talk about who they are in narrative terms. But if you know their story from before, from someone else, then you will realize that actually they can't order the events properly anymore. Something happens to the temporal order of their narrative. So they talk about who they are, but they'll talk about things that happened in completely mixed up sequences. So Alzheimer's goes in and starts actually scrambling your narrative and eventually destroys that, right? But what is important here, there are two things going on. One is this idea that if you can't consciously say who you are, then somehow your narrative self is completely gone. And it turns out that there are many, many situations, and people who have been around people with Alzheimer's will know that just because the person cannot talk about who they are doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of their selfhood that can be expressed through their body. For instance, if you learned how to ride a bike, now learning how to ride a bicycle is part of your narrative. You know, you can tell someone, I know how to ride a bicycle, or you can ride the bicycle, because that's your body knows how to do it. And in Alzheimer's patients, riding a bicycle is the wrong example, but there are situations where, like I'll take an example of an American conductor, Aaron Copland. He had Alzheimer's to the point where if you left him at a street corner, he would not know where he was, but you put him in front of his orchestra, and he could conduct his orchestral suite. I think the famous one that he did was Appalachian Spring, and he could. This is a man who did not know where he was standing if you put him at a street corner, but in front of, an orchestra, he would be able to conduct the orchestra. So there was something about his narrative, and the fact that he's a conductor is very much a part of his story, very much a part of his narrative self, but that was embodied. So Alzheimer's is really telling us that our narrative, what we are at that level in terms of the story, is not just cognitive. There's a lot of us that is embodied. And when I say it's in the body, it doesn't mean that the brain is not involved. Of course the brain is involved, but it's not something that is accessible to conscious recall in the same way that your other aspects of your story might be. But the bigger question that Alzheimer's poses is, if the narrative is gone, both cognitive and embodied, say your embodied skills are gone and your cognitive skills are gone, and you have no way of telling anyone who you are in terms of your story, is there still no one in there that is experiencing, for instance, hunger or pain as their own experience? Is the pain that they're feeling or the hunger that they're feeling an unowned experience? That can they say, I am hungry, and does that I mean anything, right? Even if there's no story behind that I. Does that make sense? Like your narrative can be completely wiped out, and yet, is it possible that there is still an I that can say, I feel hungry, without having any sense of the larger story of who one is? And unfortunately, given how badly off Alzheimer's patients are towards the end stage of their disease, they are unable to tell you an answer to that question, and you have to then start asking the question about that notion of I by looking at other situations. So, body integrity identity disorder. Again, all of us here probably will, look at our bodies and just, close our eyes and have a sense of your body, and you will say, yeah, this is my body. If you think about your hand, this feels like my hand. If you think about your leg, it feels like your leg. Is it at all possible that that may not be always true? It turns out that there is a condition called BIID, in which people experience lack of ownership of certain body parts. And the best way to understand what might be happening here is to look at a reverse condition called phantom limbs. Now, this is something that most of us are much more familiar with, primarily because of a book written by V.S. Ramachandran called Phantoms in the Brain. He's done a lot of work on this idea, but the thing that phantom limbs are a condition where if you for some reason had to have an amputation because of an accident or injury or infection or something, you've lost a limb, but you continue to feel the presence of that limb. Not only do you continue to feel the presence of that limb, you may even feel pain in that limb. So you get something called phantom pain. But the key thing here is sometimes some people who have had an amputation still feel that they have the limb that obviously in physical terms is no more. What is it that they're perceiving? What is it that they perceive as their limb? And this is very real for them, right? You cannot question the authenticity of their perception. You can question the reality of their perception, but in terms of how it feels subjectively to them from within, the limb is present, and it's not up for debate in that sense. Now, it turns out that one explanation for what might be happening here is that when we perceive our body, we are not really perceiving the physical body in terms of, the leg. We are perceiving a representation of the body in the brain. And if everything is working well, the representation of the body in the brain, and there are many representations possibly in the brain of the body, the representations in the brain and the actual physical body should be congruent. They should match up, and it'll all be fine. And so in some sense, you are feeling your physical body because there's a one-to-one correspondence with the representations or maps in the brain and the actual body. But when things go wrong, like they do in the phantom limb syndrome, you still continue to perceive the limb because all you're perceiving is the map, the information in the brain, right? Now, there's a neuropsychologist in Switzerland called Peter Brugger who came up with this phrase that phantom limbs are animation without incarnation, where the limb is animated in your mind, but the physical incarnation of that limb is now no more. And he thinks BIID is kind of a mirror problem. So you can imagine a situation where you have incarnation without animation, where you have the physical limb, everything is fine physiologically, it's healthy in all respects, except that something about the representation of the limb in your brain is slightly off. And this seems to be what's happening in BIID, where people will say that, you know, this leg is not mine, or this arm is not mine. Sometimes they'll have the condition affecting both arms. So when you look at it in this context, it doesn't seem that surprising that things can go wrong. And the unfortunate thing is when things go wrong in BIID, partly it's not a medically recognized condition, so no one's really done any research on how to help people who are suffering from this condition. And people take matters into their own hands. They actually try to reconcile their internal perception of their own body with the physical reality. So if a part of their limb is not feeling like their own, they will sometimes go and get an amputation. And paradoxically, once the amputation happens, they say they feel more complete. So it's very hard to wrap your head around what might be happening, but there is some evidence now coming out from labs like V.S. Ramachandran's lab in San Diego and Peter Brugger's lab in Zurich that there are neurological changes in the brains of people who are suffering from BIID, and those changes seem to be in brain areas that are responsible for body maps. So something is happening. What is not clear is whether those changes are the cause of BIID, because these people are scanned and you see these changes in the images. Now, these are just correlations. All it tells you is that these changes are correlated with the condition. It's not telling you whether there were actual neurological changes that led to this subjective feeling and the condition, or that they spent a lifetime, 20 years thinking, I don't want this leg, I don't want this leg, and somehow that ended up creating the neurological changes that you see when they're 40 or 50, right? But the horrific thing is, at the end of it, some of the solutions they have are unpleasant, where they do go and amputate their limb to reconcile a mismatch between their perceived body and the physical body. From the point of view of understanding the self, what is this telling us? This is telling us that the bodily self, the self that we perceive as our own, is actually something that has a lot to do with representations in the brain, right? And again, you come back to that whole question of, what is the I that perceives this limb or this body as my own, or what is the I that says this limb is not my own, right? In some sense, having a body, owning a body, is still not constituent of the I. It doesn't constitute the I. The I still sits slightly, the subjectivity, the thing that is experiencing either ownership of a limb or non-ownership of a limb still exists, and that remains unexplained, right? So body ownership can be, it's almost like saying, I am not my body parts. Before with Alzheimer's, you could say, and when I say I am not, that I have it in quotes out there, it's not the person in totality that one is referring to, but the I that is the subject of experiences, the very basic aspect of the self, right? So that I is not the narrative, because you can still have an I that experiences a scrambled narrative or possibly a non-existent narrative. In the case of BIID, it's clearly telling you that there is an I that can experience both ownership of body parts and non-ownership of body parts. And so you can continue like this with looking at various neuropsychological conditions and talking to people who have experienced, who are unfortunately experiencing these conditions. So for instance, schizophrenia, which is another very debilitating disorder when it's serious, people experience psychosis. Psychosis is essentially an altered sense of your own reality. They hear voices, they have thoughts in their heads that don't feel like their own. And one of the things that has been identified where schizophrenia is concerned is that what might be leading to the psychosis, even to the hearing of voices and even to the thoughts in your head that don't feel like your own, is something called an altered sense of agency. Now, sense of agency is again something we take for granted, we never question it. So if I were to pick up this bottle of water, right, I have an implicit sensation that I am doing this. It's unquestioned. I don't even question the fact that this is me doing it, right? Now, the philosophers again have argued that the sense of being a self comes from the fact that we have a sense of agency, and because we have a sense of agency, somehow there is an implicit process that gives rise to the I, because there has to be an I responsible for being an agent of an action. Now, it turns out in schizophrenia, if someone with schizophrenia were to do this, they might not feel like they did it. Even though they would do the action, their perception of that action would lack a sense of agency. Another example of where agency plays a role is if you were to try and tickle yourself. Most of you, I bet, will not be able to tickle yourself, because the brain suppresses the tickle response because it knows you are tickling yourself. Now, how does it know you are tickling yourself? Not by, it turns out it's not by, watching. Like, you can close your eyes and still do it, it wouldn't work. And the reason is because there is something happening in the brain in order for us to feel the sense of agency, which is that if I try to lift the bottle of water, there are motor commands going to my arm to lift this bottle of water. There are a copy of those commands are going to other parts of the brain, which are then predicting the sensory consequences of lifting this. So, there's aspects of my brain that are telling me that if I were to lift this, I can see that the bottle is 3/4 full. There will be a certain amount of weight I'm going to feel. I'll have the feel of plastic. So, in some sense, the brain is predicting some amount of sensory input because I'll be doing this, right? So, it's actually predicting what might happen, and then things actually happen by when you lift the bottle of water. There are receptors in your tendons and joints and muscles that are sending feedback, and your touch receptors. All of these sensations are coming back. So essentially now the brain has a copy of the command it sent, made a prediction of what it should feel like when you do the action, and the action happens, and the sensory consequences of the action come back as feedback to the brain. It compares the two. If they match, then you did it. And this is the model that has been put forth. It's called the comparator model. And if for some reason there was a mismatch, it's implicitly tagged as someone else's action. So if the match is perfect or near perfect, you are doing the action. If there is no match, it's somebody else's action. It doesn't feel like you did it. It's not somebody else. It just feels like you did do it. Now, it turns out that in schizophrenia, there's some evidence that this mechanism might be impaired. So, whatever is the pathway to generate this kind of sense of agency, that pathway has been impaired. It's not clear at what point, at what stage of the pathway things are impaired, but the consequence of that is that when they do something like this, if someone with schizophrenia were to lift this bottle of water, he or she may not feel like they're doing it. Now you can imagine the downstream consequences of constantly feeling like you're doing things, but it's not you doing it, right? You can take the remote control and switch on the TV, and the TV comes on, but it doesn't feel like you did it. So you can see how this can lead to psychosis or to paranoia that somebody is controlling you. And there are other explanations for how all of this might even lead to why you hear voices in your head and why thoughts that seem like they are someone else's. So the same way that a motor action has to be referred back to your own self and made to feel like you did it, there seems to be a case that even thoughts in your head, again, normally we would say we are our thoughts, right? But it turns out that thoughts may also need that kind of feedback to make them feel like your own. So thoughts seem to be occurring anyway in the brain, or brain-mind, it's hard to figure out. And in schizophrenia, maybe that pathway that has to refer the thought back to the self is also broken. So the thought occurs, but it doesn't feel like yours, right? And what this is telling us, again, from the point of view of the self, is that the I is not the thought, and the I is not the agent of actions. The I is, because the I can perceive both being an agent of an action, and in the case of schizophrenia, it can perceive not being the agent of the same action. And the I can perceive a thought as being one's own. It can also perceive a thought as not being one's own. So the I is still something separate. It's still unexplained. It sits below, below all of this stuff that's happening. So you can see how, in some sense, by looking at various aspects of the self that come apart, you can start asking questions about what constitutes the self, what constitutes the I. And as far as so far we can see, just about anything you take that you take for granted as being yourself are all malleable. These things can be changed. Same thing with emotions. Most of us will argue vehemently that we are our emotions. Like if I'm feeling happy, if I'm feeling angry, if I'm feeling sad, those things are me. That is I, right? But turns out that in depersonalization disorder, people feel estranged from their own emotions. They feel distant. So there is an observing self, which normally should be very, very tightly coupled to the emotion, and there should be no distance between the observing self and the observed emotion. But in the case of depersonalization, somehow something happens which brings about a certain distance between the emotion and the observing self. And this tells you also that emotions don't constitute the I. The I still remains. And so the question is, what is that I? I'm going to rush through now because we're running out of time and I want to come to a couple of things. Autism is a very complex disorder. And again, it's not thought of necessarily as a disorder of the self, but you can analyze it in that context. And one of the things that children with autism, for instance, have difficulty with is relating socially to other people. So in some sense, there is an impairment of the social self. Now, again, within philosophy of the self or philosophy of the mind, people have argued that the self is essentially just a social self. Everything that we are is because of our social interactions. And something like autism, again, challenges that. It basically says that you can have a social self that has changed, that is impaired, but there is still someone experiencing that impaired social self. Who or what is that person, right? Or who or what is that I? And there is some preliminary evidence that this impairment of the social self might have to do with impairments of the bodily self. The ability of the brain of a person with autism to have a clear perception of one's own bodies. There might be some impairment in that, and that impairment is then leading to downstream behavioral consequences. So autism was a difficult one to analyze in this context in terms of the self, but I think it does tell us a little bit about this idea that perturbations of the bodily self can have downstream cognitive consequences, behavioral consequences. So this one, to me, is probably, in terms of understanding notions of the self, one of the most illustrative. About 5% of the population would, at some time or the other in their life, would experience an out-of-body experience. So anyone here who's had an out-of-body experience? No one's going to accept it here. Oh, there's one. Okay. 2. There are 200 people here, so there should be at least 10 of you. So, but okay. The point here is that, they're going to say it. Yeah, they're still to come. That's true. Yeah, it could happen later in your life. So all of you are pretty young. So the out-of-body experiences are basically perturbations of what it means to be in body, right? I mean, again, we don't question the fact that we are in the body. What does that mean? How does the brain create this feeling of being embodied, being here now in this body? When you look at out-of-body experiences, the neuroscience of out-of-body experiences, the neuropsychology of out-of-body experiences, you start understanding that there are things that the brain has to do moment by moment by moment to keep us embodied, to keep us anchored within the body. And when those processes go wrong, you can have, for instance, the doppelganger effect is an effect where someone will perceive their own self in front and have an interaction with that self, right? So this seems like science fiction, but it actually happens, and it can be induced. The classic out-of-body experience is when people will say that their observing self, that they have left their body and they're observing their physical body from above, right? So what has left and what is doing the observing? By inducing some of these experiences in labs, in controlled settings, actually we can start understanding what might be happening in the brain to both create these kinds of illusions and hallucinations. They are hallucinations, by the way. Nothing actually leaves the body and watches over the body. At least from a scientific point of view, nothing does. But the thing is that the experience of it is so powerful that when it happens, even the most sort of disbelieving of people will say, when that was happening, I really felt like something left the body, right? So, but it's been shown in, like, for instance, there was a case where a woman was undergoing surgery for treating her epilepsy, and the surgeon had asked her if he could, as he was probing her brain, whether he could stimulate various parts of the brain. This is something that is routinely done when you're doing exploratory surgery for epilepsy. People volunteer to have their brains poked and prodded so that we can understand more about the brain. And in this particular case, there was, I think it was the angular gyrus. I don't quite know where in the brain that is, but it's a part of the brain that integrates vestibular sensations, the sensations that we have of balance. And when that part of the brain was being stimulated with an electrode, she would report just leaving the body and looking down at her body. And you could repeatedly do this. So there was obviously something very material that could be done to create the hallucination of being out of body. You can do simple experiments with things like rubber hands, and I don't have time to go into that, but there are experiments you can do in labs where you identify yourself with a virtual body. You just leave your body and identify with a mannequin or something that you're viewing in your virtual reality goggles. Now, what all of this is telling us is that in order to be in body, in order to feel like we are anchored in this body, the brain has to integrate a whole range of sensations. So we are getting a lot of external sensations, exteroception. There are also sensations from within the body that we are not consciously aware of, and these are interoceptive sensations that all have to come to the brain. And the brain has to integrate all of this information in order to create three things. One is self-location. It has to locate the self in this body. So there is a volume of space that there's a geometric frame of reference. And it has to do something called self-identification, that the self has to identify with the body, and it has to provide a perspective, like we mentioned earlier, that you have this perspective of looking out at the world from within your head, and this feeling that everything is happening to you, right? And philosophers have begun arguing that if the brain, if you can explain how the brain does these three things, provide self-location, self-identification, and first-person perspective, you can start explaining why the sense of I comes about, right? And experiments to do with out-of-body experiences are all beginning to show that this is indeed what's happening in the brain. There are certain locations in the brain that have been identified, like the temporoparietal junction, where a lot of this integration happens. Ecstatic epilepsy, this is really quite an extraordinary condition where people who are suffering from it actually won't even say they're suffering from it, because when you read what they describe about how it feels, you can see that it's actually a very pleasurable experience, unless this seizure then proceeds to knock them unconscious, or usually this is what's called a focal seizure. A very small part of the brain is affected and you don't become unconscious. But they have a heightened sense of their own body and environment. So they are seeing colors more vividly, they're hearing sounds more vividly. They will say things like, until the seizure happened, everything I perceived felt like it was in 2D, and then suddenly everything popped into 3D. I mean, it's just a subjective way of describing what's happening to them, but they have feelings of bliss and mental and physical well-being. They have a sense of time slowing down. The seizure might last 1 or 2 seconds, but they feel like half an hour has gone by. They have very solid, strong feelings of certainty. So they will say things like, when I observe the room during the seizure, every chair, every table, everything that's around me seems to be in exactly the place it should be, that nothing is out of order. In fact, the order is it's so specific that they feel like there must be a divine order to things, right? And then, of course, then the seizure stops, and if the person having the seizure is an atheist, then all of that divinity goes out. But if not, then yeah, you go another way. And there's another very paradoxical thing. They're saying that they feel their body and the environment very, very intensely, which means that they're feeling some aspect of their self very intensely, yet some boundary with the other also goes away, and they feel like they're one with something larger. So these are the descriptions of how they feel. Now, turns out there has been evidence coming out in the last 2 or 3 years as to what might be happening. The seizure seems to begin in a place called the insula, which is a region that's tucked beneath the frontal and temporal lobes. It's a deep brain region of sorts, and it's a brain region that is integrating just about every possible sensation to create a perception of one's bodily self. And when the seizure happens, the hypothesis is that the insula has become overactive and it's creating a really heightened perception of the body, which it's normally doing anyway, but during the seizure, all of that is heightened up. And it seems like the other cognitive resources in the brain that are normally keeping your narrative story alive, right? Like if you think about yourself right now, there's a part of you that's aware of your story. There's a part of you that is sitting here saying, I need to get out of this room and go have some coffee. And so there's a cognitive element to it. But there's also a part of you that's just a body sitting, experiencing the sights and sounds, as boring as they might be. But it's doing that, right? So what seems to be happening in ecstatic epilepsy is all the brain resources seem to be going into actually experiencing the bodily self intensely in terms of the sensations, and the cognitive resources that are necessary for keeping the narrative alive are now dampened down. So the boundary that seems to have gone between the self and other is the boundary that's created by the narrative, by what you can call the ego, whatever phrase you want to use for that. But the story shuts down for that moment, and all you're left with is this intense feeling of being here and now. And if this seems like what mystics talk about their experiences, could be. Maybe that's what they're having. Maybe they're having ecstatic seizures. Who knows, right? But as far as I'm concerned, it's really telling us something about how the brain is constructing the self. That there is a cognitive narrative component. There is a bodily self, and and ecstatic epilepsy is allowing us actually to get to the heart of at least one aspect of that sentient self, which is the insular cortex. And there have been, again, experiments done where somebody with epilepsy was being experimented upon, and by stimulating part of the left anterior insula, they could actually create the ecstatic experience. And the moment you stop it, the ecstasy goes away. You stimulate it, it comes back. So make of it what you will, but in terms of whether it's divine, not divine, those are difficult questions to answer. But it's actually telling you that a lot of these things are actually malleable and things that are happening in the brain, and the brain has to work hard every moment to keep us in body. Like as you're walking up and down, the brain is keeping track of your body and keeping you anchored, and it's a computation that's going on all the time. So through all this, what you're left with eventually is that the I is still not clear, right? The subjectivity, where does that subjectivity come from? Explaining the I. All of these conditions we saw, you can experience having emotions, you can experience not having emotions. You can experience being in body, you can experience being out of body. There is still something that can be said to be experiencing everything. What is that I? Where does that come from? And it turns out that this is what the philosophers and neuroscientists and theologians are arguing about. They are not arguing about these other aspects of the self. All of those things are literally malleable and constructions of the brain. They can be called, they can be said to be illusions in the sense that the narrative is an illusion in the sense that there is no narrator that is constructing it. It is something that the brain is putting together. The question is who is experiencing or what is experiencing that narrative or lack of a narrative. And now it depends on who you talk to. You talk to the bundle theorists like David Hume, who's dead now, but or talk to certain people who are of Buddhist traditions. They will say that it's just that. It's a bundle of sensations. If that goes away, there's nothing there. There are self-theorists. There are people who will argue that in order for us to feel this unity that I talked about earlier, this diachronic and synchronic unity, that there must be some neural process that has to be the recipient of experiences. Somehow that subject or subjectivity has to arise first, and then everything is constructed on top of that in the brain. There are others who will say that actually the self is really an illusion. All that is there is consciousness, that all we are discrete moments of conscious awareness, and consciousness in some definitions has the property of reflexivity, that every moment of consciousness is aware of itself. There is no person. It is just the property of a moment of conscious awareness. So you can imagine just a stream of moments of conscious awareness, and somehow the brain then takes that and creates the larger self for each individual, and the body and brain die and the whole thing vanishes. So this is where, and there are no answers beyond this point. This is where the debate is. This is where the sticking points are, right? So, and I have this feeling that this debate about self-awareness, consciousness are all going to come to a head when we start understanding what consciousness itself is. And as of now, in neuroscience, there's very little we can say about the nature of consciousness. People are still arguing about whether it itself is an illusion, or is it real? Is it, of the material world? Is it of the immaterial world? We don't know. We don't have answers. So I think I'll leave you with one thought. If you're wondering where those shoes come from, they come from the cover of my book, and that's the book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, Anil, for this complex survey of simple and basic questions that we still don't have answers to. We've got about 10, 15 minutes for questions.
Hi, that was really interesting. I was curious, in these different theories, is there a discussion about empathy?
So yeah, empathy within autism, you do get a lot of discussion about empathy. As you will know, the children with autism, people with autism, are said to have an impaired theory of mind. And theory of mind is this ability that we all have to be able to infer what is happening in someone else's mind. So if I look at someone, and just by observing their behavior, I kind of infer or I have a theory of what might be happening in their mind. I can make judgments about their motivations, intentions, desires, etc. And this is an instinct. This is a perceptual thing. It's not something you consciously do. It's happening all the time with us. So as I'm doing this, waving my hands, you are probably making judgments about what's happening in my mind, right? And that's very instinctive. And it turns out that, unfortunately, children with autism struggle with this. So this theory of mind, the ability to have a theory of mind, develops around the age of 4 to 6, but it doesn't develop as fast or as well in children with autism. And you can see why empathy is related to theory of mind. In order for me to empathize, in order for me to understand what someone else might be feeling, I really need to have this ability. And it turns out that this ability of being able to read someone else's mind is also linked to being able to read my own mind. So if I am unable to read my own mind, like if you take if you ask someone with autism to introspect and ask them to write down the contents of their mind when they do their introspection, you will find that they are lacking certain details that most people would take for granted. For instance, feelings. They will not be able to tell you much about their own feelings. It's almost like the ability to look inward and have a sense of your own, contents of your own mind is related to sort of being able to do that with someone else, and empathy comes in at that point.
Hello. Sir, I have two questions. One is related to this Alzheimer's. So does the patient with Alzheimer's at the last stages, can he remember his language, like mother tongue or something, to say something?
They become very, very quiet. It's almost like if you talk to caregivers who are looking after people with Alzheimer's, they will say that there is no one in there anymore. They will say like the person I knew is gone. So pretty much all cognitive skills get wiped out, including language and mother tongue. But what is interesting is that there are moments of lucidity. There are people even in end-stage Alzheimer's suddenly will display a moment of lucidity that is still unexplained as to why that's happening. If indeed the cortex has been wiped out, as Alzheimer's can do, where does that come from? So there are still some things that are unexplained about Alzheimer's.
Yeah, one more small question.
Yeah.
So regarding this ecstatic epilepsy, so people like this Aisha Foundation, Jaggi Vasudev, they will explain that they have this feeling when they are this enlightened being or something. So they say that they'll be able to feel that outside and inside both are same. And hours and hours where they felt that they spent like 14 minutes or so, but outside world it was like some 4 hours, 5 hours are over, and in that meditative states they are there. So he has given in the TED talk also the same explanation he has given. You are saying something about this ecstatic epilepsy, but both are matching to me little bit.
Yeah, so I'll let you decide what that might mean. But here's a point to keep in mind, right? Whenever anyone is it doesn't matter what they're saying, whenever someone is saying that here's a subjective experience that I've had and it's the truth, point them to Cotard syndrome. Here's someone who's perfectly alive physiologically and is saying I don't exist. Why is that truth any less important than someone who says I exist, or I am one with the universe, or I am not one with the universe? So I really think we need to be very, very skeptical. Because there are situations where when someone is saying, I am hearing voices, right, and they are suffering because of it, they really are hearing voices. But you also know that there are no voices in their heads. I mean, no one has gone into their heads and put voices in, right? But their subjective experience of that is very real. You have to take that seriously. But it doesn't correspond to reality. So when someone says, I feel one with the universe, they might feel that. What does that mean? I don't know. Right? It might be just one person's subjective experience of something that has no bearing on reality, or maybe it does. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think anyone does.
Thank you.
So, on that note, when you were saying that in out-of-body experiences, there is scientifically nothing which is actually going outside the body, has anyone tested that? For example, you stand behind the patient and draw something on the wall.
There are people who have. So, all tests that have been done to try and figure that out have failed. So, for instance, there are things that are put on tops of, sort of in an operation theater. There will be things that are put at a height where you can only see that if you are actually up there. No answers as to what is up there if you're actually having that experience.
Sorry, no answers, or the person did not see it? They
don't see it. So, in the sense that nothing actually goes up and looks down, and the answer. The answer seems to be, so there's a German philosopher called Thomas Metzinger, who's actually one of the people who I write about in the book. He has had out-of-body experiences, but he's also, a philosopher who has a very empirical bent of mind. And so he did these tests on himself. He said, okay, well, if I'm having these experiences, let me at least figure out what is happening. Do I actually leave my body? And he says, his own test. I mean, that's the problem with all these things, that they are subjective, and this will always be a problem when we are talking of consciousness and states of mind, that subjective experience have to collide with objective empirical science. And so if one person, like a philosopher, is saying, I didn't see any evidence, that's not proof, that's just anecdotal evidence of the fact that he didn't leave his body, even though he felt like he had left his body. Right? His contention is that he has a whole elaborate theory of how the self is constructed. It's basically everything that we are based models in the brain, right? And when you have an out-of-body experience, what's happening is that the subjectivity, whatever that subjectivity is, we still don't know what that is. That's navigating an internal model of the mind, in the mind. So it's you perceive it as if you're left, but because in your mind, in your brain, there is for instance, a model of this room. During that experience, you're navigating that model, and it feels real to you, just like it feels real to us right now. We might all be having out-of-body experiences for all we know, but yeah, there's no proof whatsoever at this point.
Anil, do you know of patients of Cotard syndrome who do they experience moments of lucidity, like Alzheimer's patients?
I don't know that. The Cotard's is very, has been studied very little. There literally are just about 200 cases over the last, 100 years, and only recently have they been studied with scanners, and so no, I don't know.
If there were patients of Cotard's who had moments of lucidity, would that change anything?
I don't know what that lucidity would mean in the context of Cotard's. You mean that they go from saying I don't exist to saying I exist?
Yeah, I now recognize that I exist.
That's entirely possible. Cotard's is transient. Yeah, it is transient. It's not necessarily a permanent thing. So it is transient.
So I have two questions. The first question is my medical question related to ecstatic epilepsy. So you said that the seizures last for just 2 seconds, for example.
It could last for very little. It could be 30 seconds.
So how do the doctors check whether the patient has got the ecstatic epilepsy, and the patient himself knows like he got that?
So what happens, when you're studying people with epilepsy, they have to sort of volunteer to be studied when they're having, so you get them into these rooms where you fit them with, very, very dense array of scalp electrodes. You're monitoring their EEG, and the moment, a seizure is triggered, then automatically you would, in this particular case, for instance, you would inject a tracer into their blood, which then enters the brain and gets fixed, so that then when you wheel them into a scanner, you can see where that activity was. So they would have to agree to be tested like that. So you can do nuclear imaging of people who are having the seizure, and they can subjectively tell you what that seizure was like.
So do the patients know that they are suffering from that seizures?
Yeah.
Like how do they get to know from that?
Well, because your experience right now, like when you're having the seizure, is very like I'll give you an example of one of the guys I write about. He is from a place in Detroit, in Michigan called Kalamazoo, which is apparently a drab, dreary town. He hates it, but he says when I'm having the seizure, this is the most beautiful place on earth. He says it's not possible that it could be that beautiful, right? So he knows.
And my second question was, suppose a person is remembers like he was at some place, but he doesn't remember the name or the. So does that relate to Alzheimer's disease, like initial stage of Alzheimer's?
Dementia. Well, there are lots of different kinds of dementia, and so it's, in the initial stages, it's very hard to tell Alzheimer's from some other form of dementia. It takes a while to figure out whether it's Alzheimer's or whether it's frontotemporal dementia or just senile dementia. You just get dementia as you get older. It'll happen to all of us.
Hi. Anil?
Yeah.
So what we've talked about till now is one person, one sense of self. But how do you think multiple personality disorder fits into this context?
I didn't look at if I could go back, I would look at multiple personalities, because that really is very intriguing. What it's suggesting is that there are multiple narratives, right? We all have one narrative that we think we are, but someone with multiple personality disorder can inhabit very tightly boxed in narratives that are different. So I don't know much more than that, but that's, to me, it would be something like what Alzheimer's tells us about the narrative self, that the narrative self is a construct, except in the case of multiple personality disorder, there are multiple narratives being constructed, and you can inhabit any one of them and not know about the other. What's interesting is that even the memory systems are separate. So,
a comment and a question. There's one thing that came to mind was Richard Feynman has described out-of-body experiences in his book. And while we are on the topic of Richard Feynman, have you, while researching the book, looked at pharmacological means by which...
Not for out-of-body experiences, but for ecstatic epilepsy. So it turns out that when you do scanning studies of people who have taken psychedelic substances, you read Aldous Huxley, right? His Doors of Perception, right? The description is not very different from someone describing an ecstatic seizure, except he was taking psilocybin, right? So, and when you actually scan people who take psychedelic substances, it turns out that again the anterior insula is implicated. There seems to be overactivity in the anterior insula. So there is some correlation with psychedelics. Yeah.
Hello, Anil.
I have a question about actually two things. The first one is, in your thinking about self and the subjectivity, and talking to all of these people who are researching it, what I'm wondering is to what extent are we locked in or blocked by language? In other words, it's a little difficult to phrase this, but it's hard to talk about perception. Is it a problem of language? In other words, is the I created by the fact that we have to talk to ourselves and to others about about that subjectivity? I mean, is this a topic that comes up?
It is a valid question, right? I mean, and again, philosophers have argued, just like philosophers have argued that your narrative self or your narrative is constitutive of the I. And it turns out that no, you can lose your narrative and there can still be something that is the subject of an experience. And with language, I think all you have to do is look at babies, right? A baby doesn't have language. A 1 day old baby is capable of distinguishing its bodily self from another. So babies have something called a rooting reflex. So if you touch a baby's cheek, more often than not, if the touch is from someone else, babies constantly touch their own cheek, but they will not turn towards their touch. But if someone else, say their mother or father was touching or somebody else was touching their cheek, they will immediately turn. So something about their bodily self already knows that it touched itself versus somebody else touched me. There is a subjectivity present, and it's not dependent on language or conscious recall. None of the cognitive skills that we normally associate with an adult selfhood is present in babies, yet there is a selfhood. So
that's a good point. And the second thing, which is quite different, if I may deepen the mystery, in a sense. There's this fascinating aspect that, we have turnover at a completely different level from the psychological, right? We are turning over cells and molecules, and some of our cells, not our cortical neurons, but it seems, but other of our cells which are part of our embodied sense of self, I would think, are turning over extremely rapidly. Is this something that enters into the discussions at all? I mean, forget about molecular turnover, but even cell.
I didn't. I mean, that's a hard one to no.
Well,
I don't have an answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question here. So you said something about when you do something, you know that you are doing it.
Yeah.
And in one of your examples you gave, the person don't know that he actually did it, or going out of body, and many of these things can be induced. I have a question here about hypnotism. I don't know how much it's true. So when you are hypnotized, you don't know that you did it. So is that something which is in? I mean, how do you reconcile?
Another fascinating topic that I didn't get a chance to delve into, just like multiple. But I think hypnosis would be something that really needs. There's just enough science beginning to happen.
Well, is that true? Can people be hypnotized?
I don't know. I mean, people can be hypnotized. I mean, the people will tell you. So here's the thing. In order to study all these things, you have to somehow match descriptions of subjective experiences with some objective measurement of what's happening, and hypnosis would be particularly difficult, as is any of these things, because these are all internal, descriptions of what one is feeling. And there is no way to like if someone says this leg does not belong to me, right? How are you objectively going to measure that feeling? You have to take that person at their word in some sense, right? So a lot of these situations, including hypnosis, will run into that problem. And I don't have an answer about it. I didn't look into that.
Here.
So at some point you mentioned something about tagging, like you.
Sorry, say that again.
Something about tagging. You said you perform action and.
Oh, tagging, yeah.
Yes. So is that can I just?
Yeah.
So is that a neuropsychological sort of concrete concept, and does it work similarly between the self and the other? And
yeah, there seems to be. I mean, tagging is just I just use a general conceptual term to describe what might be happening. Why does this feel like I did it, right? So you can either say that, oh, there is an I and that I did it, or there was a motor command that, was sent out and all of the neural processing happened in order to tag the action as mine, right? So that tagging depends on comparing the sensory consequences of doing the action with the prediction of what the sensory consequences would be. If they match, it's a tag. If they don't, then it's somebody else's action. So there seem to be neural processes that are doing this, and there's definitely some evidence to that effect.
So do we know the neural substrates for tags?
Oh, no, not at that level, no. This is all system level talk right now.
Yeah, so I heard stories and seen few documentaries about the concept of this rebirth. I wanted to know how authentic they are.
I have no idea.
How authentic they are, and if that is the case, then is it like kind of an eye getting data transferred to some other?
No, look, I stopped this book at the point where I say we don't understand subjectivity. That's it. And that's all I can say with any confidence, that we don't understand subjectivity. Make of it what you will. Is there a consciousness that is... How are we to know? I mean, I think that's the point that I think finally should be hammered home, is that why should we take anyone's subjective experience as truth when there are so many situations where they're not, right? That's it. I mean, keep thinking about that. That's
So. Hello.
Yeah.
So I just had a question regarding all these knowledge that we are getting that we have. We are not this body. We are not this narrative. We are not this. We are not that. Whatever. So how can we use this knowledge in our day-to-day life, in our dealings, so that our life can be better? Say the way we do all our science, we try that the science will bring a better quality of life. This is also a type of science. So how do you think that this study would help us to have a better quality of life?
Well, first of all, you'll have to define what quality of life means to you. For some people, it could be having $1 million. For somebody else, it could be living very simply. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, all of this is subjective. fundamentally. And if you can understand that much of what we are is a construct, and that somehow you can distance yourself from that construct, and again, we run into problems with language. You know, who's doing the distancing? What are you distancing from? I dedicate this book to all those of us who want to let go but wonder who is letting go of what. Right? Okay.
So here.
One more question, apparently.
Yeah. It's a very cliched debate, but I would like to reopen it here because after hearing to your talk, I have some new views about it. Like death, how would you see it? I mean, after hearing to your talk, death seems very, ambiguous. I mean, it's like, what would you say? I mean, it's like, it's just like losing yourself, or it's like extending yourself to some we call it something, some other we. I mean, it's like very ambiguous. I mean, how do you,
well,
has anybody done anything, some work for this?
Scientifically, no, there are no answers, honestly. I mean, there are, like I said, all that this approach does is take us to the point where it points out that much of what we consider ourselves as being solid and immutable is actually not so. Much of what we consider solid, right? The narrative, the sense of body ownership, all of these things are, mutable. They can change, and but what remains unexplained is where that sense of I come from. Now, if that sense of I is the product of some sort of witness consciousness that, say, the Advaitin tradition posits, well, that has implications. Whether it is something that just is an appearance because of the interaction of the mental and physical elements that constitute us, and if you actually take it apart, nothing is there, that has implications. But how do we prove that? We don't have any proof at this point. So I think we really have to leave it at that point of an essential mystery and say, hopefully we'll figure it out. But don't take anyone's word for it. That's the point.
Here? Yeah. Hello. Can I ask a question? Here. The first row.
There's one more.
One question here.
Oh, well, she's calling the shots, so one more question.
Yeah, I think your talk reminded me of this movie called The Awakening, where a bunch of patients in US, schizophrenic patients.
Parkinson's.
Parkinson's. They are administered this magic drug and they magically heal, only to realize that the healing is temporary and they all revert back to their diseases. So a lot of times it's difficult to track the process of how they disconnect with their self during the onset of diseases. But if some of these diseases are reversible or if they are curable, are there answers to these questions in the process of how they heal, how they connect back to their self?
Potentially. I mean, those are profound questions, right? I mean, like I said, even in Alzheimer's, there are situations where towards the end stage Alzheimer's, suddenly there will be lucidity. Everything about what this person was seems to come back. Now, if you are explaining Alzheimer's as a consequence of all the destruction of neural tissue, that tissue is destroyed. I write about a person who is a big part of one of the chapters on Alzheimer's, and when they did an autopsy on his brain, it was like the last stage Alzheimer's. But when you talk to him, he didn't have that level of destroyed narrative. He was cognitively fairly okay. So there are mysteries. I mean, I shouldn't say mysteries, that makes it sound mystical, the things we don't understand fully, right? And maybe we will, and yeah, I mean, the more we understand that, it will have implications for healing and what it means to heal, and yeah.
Do you have any understanding of self across the phylogenetic tree?
Where? Yeah, apparently. Okay, one last question. And
across the phylogeny, any idea of I?
Oh, you mean in animals?
Across the phylogeny, yeah.
I think there is. I mean, even if you did a simple mirror test, right, which is controversial in itself, but the mirror test does reveal that some animals, some birds, seem to recognize their own image, and that has implications. What does that mean? We don't know. We can't ask the birds. And it's also possible that the mirror test is terribly flawed because an animal's perception of itself as a body or as an entity may not have much to do with vision. They might have other modalities by which they perceive their self, which are something that we are not aware of at all. So I think anecdotally, if you talk to, actually there's a new book that's come out by Carl Safina that if I'm not mistaken, that there's enough evidence that they do have some sense of self. Whether they have a narrative self is a different issue. maybe elephants. I don't know. I mean, no one knows. But the fact that an animal might have a sense of being a body, I don't see why not. If we accept the fact that we have evolved and this is a continuum, then it's not possible that we are suddenly formed. There must be stages of the evolution of the self, and animals must have some aspects of this. Yeah. All right, we'll stop at that. Thank you so much.